All right, so let's talk about requirements engineering on the different techniques, all the challenges, and also the jargon. There's a lot of jargon and terminology that we're going to be using throughout the semester. So first of all, what is a requirement? All right, so basically there's certainly a formal definitions. The IEEE defines them, but the most basic definition is that it's just a feature, right? Some human being needs to be able to fulfill a particular goal, right? And presumably that would be converted into some feature that some application implements to allow this human being to fulfill that particular goal. Yes. Now there are different requirements depending on who you ask, right? At different levels of the organization. If you ask a business owner or they'll give you lots of business objectives. They'll give you some very high-level, long-term objectives that they want to achieve. These are the folks who own the business or have a vision for where they want to take the business, and they'll sound very abstract, right? That you don't even know how would this be converted into anything that you want to build. Yes, but then. Different requirements at different other levels, depending on, again, who you ask, you get a different point of view of the different requirements that what needs to be done, right? And for instance, if you ask a user, an actual user who uses the application day to day, right, maybe from an application that already exists, you will find them. The user will be praising the application, or they hate it, right? And they'll have all sorts of opinions, right, of what they can do, what they can't do, the whole sorts of pros and cons. They have all sorts of pain points on how is it they would think that the application would be much better. So for those, we call those user requirements, right? And at each level of the requirements gathering process, we're always seeing if these requirements at different levels, if they conflict, right? If they are if they're consistent, right? That what the user is asking for has nothing to do with what the business wants to do, or the business wants to go in one direction, but the users are actually asking to go in a completely different direction. Maybe the business wants to spend a lot of money about implementing a feature that no one's going to use. That's very, very common, right? That the business implements a set of features. They spend a lot of focus on a particular feature, but not so much on these other features. But when they put it out there, right, turns out the users ignore the feature that they spend so much time and effort implementing, and they totally love this really rinky-dinky small little feature, which then it kind of goes back and challenges the original business objectives and business requirements that the business had all along. Right, and so at every step, right, at every step of different layers, they're always in contrast with one another. They have to, challenge each other. Right, it doesn't mean that because the business wants to go one way, right, the user are clamoring for something else. Right, so they're always gonna validate against each other. Even in the functional requirements, that this is where we have the actual developer is going to implement something. They might have an actual detailed implementation strategy of what is it they're going to be building. They're going to display it as a table or as a list or drop down or certain things like that. The user requirement might say, I need to select a user. Yes, but it leaves it at that level. I need to be able to select a user. The functional requirement might be a little more specific. It says I'll implement a drop down where I can select a user. Or it might say, well, no, I'll provide an input field where you can type the username or the first name or last name, and then it filters out as you type, right? Or I might give you a long list of users that maybe you can paginate through, right? And you can go one user, 10 at a time or 20 at a time, looking for a particular user. There's many ways of selecting a user, right? So the use case or the user requirements leave it vague, implementation-wise, but it'll be very explicit of what I want to achieve. Select a user. I need to be able to select a user. But the functional requirement will go even further and say, okay, this is how we're going to implement it. Right? For this user requirement, we'll implement it one way, and from some other user requirement, we'll implement it in a different way, where it makes sense. Yes? right? So this is functional requirements are derived from user requirements, and even here, the functional requirement, when the developer is given the functional requirements to implement them, they too are expected to question the requirements. Why are we building this, right? And go back and say, well, why do we even have this user requirement? This makes no sense. Or it might say that it's not complete enough. I don't have enough information to actually implement it. Right? Oftentimes these requirements assume a best case scenario, right? A perfect world, right? An ideal world, yes? And they neglect to consider all sorts of edge cases, right? They might the selective user, the UI folks might have shown a list of users, right? Maybe in a table or something, yes? And but they neglected to include details of what do I show when there are no users. Is it just the heading and just nothing in there? Should there be some message saying that there are no users in the systems yet, right? Or click here to add a user? Should there be any of that? And what about if there's the user interface guys are displaying 10 users? But what about if there's thousands of users or hundreds of thousands of users? That's completely useless, right? To be able to display a long list of this, I'm going to scroll through this, makes no sense, right? So do I need pagination? Do I need filtering? So at the implementation level, at the functional requirements level, we need to question the user requirements and the business requirements, because we're at the implementation level, we're looking at lots of the edge cases that probably were missed somewhere in between. Yes? So as a developer, we have that responsibility. We also have non-functional requirements, as I mentioned earlier, the quality of service, right? That we're asking for a certain level of security, a certain level of availability, lots and lots of ilities, lots of understandability, right? Usability, all these ilities, that these are qualitative, right? As opposed to perhaps quantitative. That we are looking for a level of quality from the application. And depending on those levels of quality, that might impose certain implementation restrictions, right? That perhaps we need to use queues, or we need to use certain peer-to-peer implementations that would impose certain implementation restrictions, right? And then all sorts of implementation requirements, such as whether we need to use a particular set of browsers, we need to use a particular set of databases, NoSQL or SQL or whatever, right? And then all sorts of business constraints about certain hours of operation, weekends, holidays, and certain things like that are particular to your business. So here's a couple of examples of requirements. So for instance, in the business requirements, you would have some very high level requirements, are very long term, very vague perhaps, that we're not quite sure how is it that we're going to implement that. Ideally, from these requirements, such as reduce incorrectly processed orders by 50%. Right, so presumably that has been affecting our bottom line, money that is not coming in, yes, negatively. And so we want to identify, well, why are people returning their products? What's going on? Is it that they're ordering the wrong thing, right? Are they ordering the right thing, but then the quality is not there? So we try to break it up on what is the problem. And from those problems, we try to solve, well, what can we, on our side, if it's because people are ordering the wrong thing, maybe the users are confused on what they're ordering, right? So that can fall into some user requirement on how can we make it more clear for the user of what they're ordering. Maybe better pictures, maybe a video, maybe some reviews. Some folks can say what they think about a particular product so that they don't order in the first place. Right? We want to make sure that we want to reduce that. Right? So from these business requirements, certainly it'll flow through into some user requirements that we're actually going to be building. Right? And these user requirements typically are documented using use case analysis, which we'll do Friday, right? That specify for each one of these user requirements, each one of these features, what are the steps that a user would follow specifically to achieve that particular goal. Okay. All right. And for each one of those steps, for each one of these user requirements, and each one of the steps in these use cases that describe this, you'll have different functional requirements, whether it'll be a drop down, it'll be a table, it'll be a list, it'll be the actual what is it that we're actually going to be building. Non-functional, allow up to 200 concurrent users. Functional requirement, display customer's last name as a link, allow sorting by account opening date, or implementation that it must use a particular browser or database. Business rules, there might be some policy or legal constraints on operating the business on weekends or late at night or holidays or certain respects on limitations on when can we return certain products if it's not more than 90 days and certain things like that. And we would capture that in a business rule catalog to just list all the constraints that we need to make sure that we meet based on regional laws or regional or institutional laws that we need, rules that we need to follow. Scope, again, we're going to go through a lot of the jargon, right? Scope, we mean the entire body of things that need to be built. All the things that need to do. It's kind of like a huge to-do list, right? All the things that we need to do. And we need to manage this humongous list of things that we need to do. And the list keeps going bigger and bigger, right? And nobody's so when this list keeps growing, this scope of things that we're going to be doing, typically we refer to as scope creep, right? That at some point we try to settle on a particular body of things that we need to do, and when we thought we agreed that this is what we're going to be doing, as we progress, slowly but surely, things keep getting piled on, right? New and new things are being piled onto this list of things, and we're still being asked to deliver by the end of the year, right? But more and more things are being asked of us, but the resources don't seem to grow any further, so things seem to increase. Stakeholders are any human being that is somewhat interested in the success of your product, right? These could be folks that are sponsoring your product, or they're putting the money, investing in this product, but also just regular folks who are actually using your product, right? That have a stake in it. That whether if it doesn't meet certain features, they're just going to stop using your product. So anybody who has any effect on your product succeeding is a stakeholder. Requirements management, we know that requirements are going to change over time. That's inevitable, right? Whether we're grumpy about it in the waterfall methodology, and we don't want requirements to change. We want to freeze them, and we're very formal about it, or we're very laissez-faire about it. We welcome change. We work very well in chaotic environments, like in agile, right? So regardless on which methodology you choose, whether you're going to be grumpy or happy about it, requirements are going to change. That's inevitable, right? The way you react about it is different, right? So we need, in any case, we need a process that we can manage that chaos, right? So typically, depending on the size of your organization, you will have committees that are responsible for overseeing the changes of these requirements. Folks will be proposing changes. It says there'll be some statistical analysis, a report that we need to add a new column, or we need to be able to sort by some other feature, or we need to be able to filter. And so all these new features, all these new requirements need to go through a process. Somebody's going to fill out a form, a request for change form, right? That's going to be reviewed by this committee every week, right? On Wednesdays at noon they meet, and they have a brown bag. They eat through this, and they prioritize it. They have more questions from the party who's proposing the change, and they prioritize it, and then they put it in some huge to-do list, right? Some backlog of things that need to be done, right? They're represented as a ticket in some planning tool such as Jira. So here's some of the activities that we first go through some definition process. We trace it, meaning we for any requirement we need to be able to trace, and keep track of whatever happened to this feature that we were going to build, right? We want to make sure that we trace it and we know what the status is, whether we have not started it yet, right? Or whether yes, it made it into the next couple of sprints, and by the way, these are all the tickets that were created in Jira for keeping track of the status of that requirement. And look, these are all the branches that were created for implementation. These were all the files that were created. These were all, so there's a traceability of knowing exactly what happened to these requirements. Here it is, requirement 1, 2, 3, and you can trace it all the way down to every single line of code that was ever written for that requirement, right? So that you can say, yes, we did work on that requirement, and you can measure how far you're along are you in fulfilling that particular requirement. So traceability, very, very important, a measure of progress, of meeting a particular requirement, evaluating the proposed changes on whether depending on the relative priority on other changes, right? We then schedule it for this phase or next phase or never, or we find other alternative, or we reject it. We reject a particular change. It either gets approved or rejected. But if it gets incorporated, right, makes it into a requirements document, and then schedule it for implementation at a particular phase. So the requirements process has several steps or several levels of detail. We are right now at this top level, the discovery phase, right? We are just now going to start reading up on the project that we're going to be building. We're going to try to document as much as we can, understand and identify some use cases from there, some functional requirements. We're just now, baby steps, right? So we're way here in the discovery phase, the elicitation. Typically, the elicitation would also have a phase where the business analyst would provide all sorts of forms for the stakeholders to fill out, right? All sorts of questions on to elicit, to gather thoughts on what it is that we're building. Also, they're probably meeting folks in brainstorming sessions and whatnot, and people yelling and debating on whether certain things are very high priority or low priority. So all that part, we're not going to have chance to do that. That's more of a business analyst kind of task. So we're only just going to get a small flavor of it. For elicitation, we're just going to do the horizontal prototype. That's part of the elicitation and discovery phase. Next week, we're going to do some analysis and modeling and start creating UML class diagrams and sequence diagrams and you actually start creating some data models and implementing them using Java classes and tables and whatnot. So that's where we're going to be going. At each level, there's going to be validation, right? Where at each step of the way, everybody should question the requirements. Requirements are not set in stone. Just because it says that it's a requirement, that doesn't mean we're going to build it, right? Especially if we're in agile, right? We're always going to question at each level, right? The users question the business, the functional question the use cases. Yes, at each level we ask, do we really need to do this? What purpose is this? And also if we do decide to build it, we need to be able to validate it to make sure that we did fulfill that requirement, right? Check, we're done. That feature went out the door. It's in production. Okay. Stakeholders. So stakeholders, the folks that most care about the product going out the door, right? They're very busy folks, right? They're way up there in the echelon in the organization. They're VPs or they're high-level managers, and their time is very expensive, right? But nevertheless, they are the ones who know the business the best, right? And us lowly folks who are implementing this and trying to understand what it is that they want us to build, we have a lot of questions, right? We don't have the same business knowledge that they have, and we're going to have lots and lots of questions about certain details that were left out inevitably. And so stakeholders are going to have a responsibility to get back to us with our questions. We're going to be respectful and send our questions. We're going to try and group together lots of questions for them. But then they have to come back to us, right? They're going to have to give us feedback. If we send them a prototype, we have to be able to tell us, do you prefer it this way, that other way? Should we move this field over here and that over there? Should we remove this column? And also the requirements they give us, they have to be able to make sure that they're not conflicting. That they make sure that if they say something one paragraph of here, they're not saying the opposite in the next paragraph, right? So they have to make sure that they're not vague, that that they're consistent, right? And they have to spend time, even though their time is very expensive. They need to spend the time to educate us and let us know what they need. Right? If we come up with an estimate that this is going to go out, 2-3 months from now, they have to respect that. It's just like we don't know their domain, they don't know our domain, right, of implementation. Right? If there are changes coming down the line, that they should inform us as soon as possible and not at the last minute when it's too late to make any changes. So elicitation, we mentioned earlier. Elicitation is the process of gathering the requirements from the end users, and through requirements workshops, folks meeting together in the same location, perhaps gathering user use cases and folks who represent the end users. Sometimes it's impossible to actually have the end users, right? It's sometimes impossible to get the actual nurses that are using the nurses station to actually come into the user requirements folks. But typically we'll have folks who can represent them or are knowledgeable enough that know about the problems that these nurses are having and what they need. Or other types of eliciting requirements is that we follow some real users. We follow them around, right, as they go about their day, right? And we're just checking notes, and it's kind of awkward, some folks looking over their shoulder what they're doing, and we're just, it's just we're trying to help you and see what are the pain points, right? Where is it that you're not productive because the screen is wrong or you need more information? Build prototype. That's a part where we are going to be doing in this assignment. We're going to build a prototype that presumably this would go out to a stakeholder. The stakeholder will look at the prototype and give us some feedback. So next week we're going to start looking at some requirements analysis and looking at whether requirements are correct, that don't conflict amongst each other, that can be validated. The results of analyzing the requirements is a document, the SRS document that we gave you. That is the results of this part of the process that you're going to be documenting. So typically this document that you're going to be working on, typically that the owner of that document would be the business analyst along with a project manager. And you would be a participant of writing that document, but you typically would not be the owner of that document, right? It would be a business analyst who would be responsible for maintaining that document, but with your input, okay? With the data models and the wireframes and the prototypes, you would be adding to that, but they would be the ones responsible for maintaining the document, communicating this document to the stakeholders, getting their approval, their sign-offs, and their feedback. Validation, as I mentioned earlier, we always have to question whether a requirement is valid, right, at different levels, right? By comparing what are the requirements at different levels, right? So that we make sure that the business requirements are consistent with the user requirements, that they're not going in opposite directions, that what the business wants to do is actually not what the user wants. Right? They're going to be spending all this money on something that nobody wants, right? And same thing with the functional requirements. So at each level we have to question them. So also the stakeholders need to provide us with a meaningful way for us to validate that indeed that what is going to be the criteria by which the stakeholder is going to accept the end product, right? So say we implemented a feature and we even before we start working on that feature, we write out what is called an acceptance criteria. So the end user is going to look at what I build, this feature. What are they going to expect that they are going to be happy that they're going to accept my implementation, right? So we write it out. It says, can you sort by last name? Can you search by username? Can you, so that we spell it out. What is the criteria? If you can do all these things, I'm going to accept your implementation. So that's spelled out early on what are the conditions. Also, we at some point, once the requirements, again, depending whether you're doing waterfall or you're doing agile, at some point you need to have some confidence that we understand it enough that we can actually start building, right? That we know there's going to be changes, we know there's going to be bumps, and we know these things, yes. But at some point we need to feel somewhat confident that we understand it well enough that we can sign off, and this would be the core set of functionality and value that we're going to be building, right? So we ask the stakeholders to sign off, not as a contract, not as a this is fixed in stone and it will never change, but at least as a milestone that we are that we have matured enough that we can start building something. And each one of this process, we're always asking, is what we're building even feasible? Do we even need it, right? Can we just leave it as a manual process? Do we have to automate everything? You know, Elon Musk tried to automate his entire, Model 3 factory, and turned out that certain aspects was better to just leave it as a manual process, right? Humans still have their value. And it was actually faster to do it manually than have a robot do it, right? So not everything has to be automated, right? So always question, right? At different levels. Make sure that what is being asked is unambiguous, that doesn't have multiple interpretations, right? That when you're going to be building it, I can interpret this as a drop-down, or I can interpret it as an input field, right? Also prioritize. At some point, somebody needs to tell us, okay, out of all these thousands of things that we need to build, where do I start? Usually by priority, right? Whatever's highest priority, I like to get started on that, right? So that if we run out of money or run out of time, at least I have some core functionality done going out the door. So requirements format. So different types of requirements have different format. User requirements. The requirements coming from the folks who are using this application. Typically, we document it using what are called use cases. So use cases, which is what you're going to be asked to do. You're going to be asked to implement 3 use cases, right? Off of 3 user requirements, and typically they're documented using UML diagrams. We're not going to be using UML until next week. And use cases is enough for now. Also because I think the use case diagrams are somewhat useless. So we're not going to do use case diagrams. Requirements traceability, as I mentioned earlier. Ideally, everything you're working on, every single line of code that you're working, is presumably in support of some business need. Right? Everything starts with a business need. That presumably is going to be implemented by that is reflected in some user requirements, that is then reflected on some functional requirements that you're actually coding. Yes, so presumably there's a traceability of saying, okay, I'm writing this, because it's this functional requirement that came from this user requirement that came from this business requirement, right? That there's a traceability on being able to go back to the whoever's paying for this and saying, yes, I'm working on that business requirement, right? This line of code is because of that. And sign off is the milestone of if the stakeholders agreeing to a particular level of confidence of being able to build something. Okay. All right. The rest of this presentation is more is more about planning and what would you build first, and prioritizing things and deciding where to start. So I'm going to leave that for when we talk about planning next week. Okay. So now have a few minutes. I'd like to discuss one of the skills that is mentioned in the assignment.